The snow fell thick and silent over the Ardennes forest in December 1944, blanketing the landscape in white that turned red too easily when men bled into it. Captain Thomas Brennan, 32 years old, and commander of Baker Company's 2nd Battalion, stood in a shallow foxhole watching the tree line where German positions flickered with muzzle flashes that had been continuous for 18 hours. His company of 200 men was surrounded, cut off from the main American lines by the massive German offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. They had been fighting without resupply or reinforcement for 3 days, their ammunition dwindling, their food exhausted, their medical supplies depleted to nothing more than morphine for the worst cases and prayer for everyone else. Brennan's face was gray with exhaustion and the weight of command decisions that grew heavier with each passing hour. He had lost 47 men since the encirclement began, their bodies frozen in positions where they had fallen, and he knew the tally would rise dramatically if circumstances did not change. The radio had gone silent 12 hours earlier, either destroyed by shelling or abandoned by headquarters that had written them off as casualties. Thomas Brennan had never intended to be a soldier, much less an officer responsible for the lives of 200 young men who looked to him for answers he increasingly doubted he possessed. Before the war, he had been a high school mathematics teacher in a small town in upstate New York, married with 2 young daughters, content with a life of equations and parent-teacher conferences and Friday night football games. The draft had transformed him from educator to warrior, and his aptitude for tactical thinking and his calm demeanor under pressure had propelled him through officer candidate school and into command. He led his men with quiet competence rather than inspirational speeches, earning their respect through consistent decision-making and a willingness to share in their hardships. But the situation in the Ardennes was beyond anything his training had prepared him for. A tactical nightmare with no good solutions and a ticking clock that counted down toward catastrophe. His officers, Lieutenant James Fisher and Lieutenant Robert Chen, had been arguing for a breakout attempt, a desperate charge through German lines that might allow some of them to escape, even if most would die in the attempt. The intelligence that would define Brennan's decision and destroy his reputation came from an unlikely source, a young German soldier captured during a patrol 2 days earlier. The prisoner, barely 19 years old and terrified, had been brought to Brennan's position and placed under guard while more pressing matters occupied the captain's attention. But as the situation deteriorated and options narrowed, Brennan had ordered the German soldier brought forward for questioning. The boy spoke broken English learned from an American uncle who had immigrated before the war, and through a combination of halting translation and desperate pantomime, he communicated information that made Brennan's blood run cold. A massive artillery concentration was being assembled to annihilate the American position. Hundreds of heavy guns that would turn the forest into a killing zone sometime within the next 12 hours. The German commanders had decided that the trapped Americans were not worth the casualties that rooting them out would require, preferring to simply obliterate the entire area with overwhelming firepower and sort through the wreckage afterward. Brennan questioned the prisoner extensively, probing for deception or misinformation, but the young German's terror seemed genuine, and his details consistent. He described gun positions and ammunition stockpiles, battery commanders and firing sequences, information that was either remarkably elaborate fiction or authentic intelligence that had fallen into Brennan's hands through sheer chance. The captain faced a choice that split along moral and tactical fault lines that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If the intelligence was accurate, remaining in their current positions meant certain death for his entire company when the barrage began. A breakout attempt might save some men but would definitely cost dozens of lives, perhaps as many as 100, with no guarantee that those who escaped the initial fighting would survive the miles of German-occupied territory between their position and friendly lines. The third option was surrender, raising the white flag and trusting that the Germans would honor the conventions of prisoner treatment rather than executing them all as a lesson to other trapped American units. Every instinct, every hour of training, every warrior tradition screamed against surrender, while his men still had weapons and ammunition, while they could still fight and die with honor intact. Lieutenant Fisher argued vehemently against even considering surrender, his face flushed with anger and something approaching contempt as he confronted Brennan in the makeshift command post. Fisher was 24, a college football star before the war, charismatic and brave, and utterly convinced that American soldiers did not surrender while they could still pull triggers. He insisted that a breakout was their only honorable course, that even if most of them died, they would die fighting rather than living with the shame of capitulation. Lieutenant Chen was quieter in his opposition but no less firm, suggesting that if surrender was truly being considered, perhaps command should pass to someone more willing to fulfill their duty as officers and leaders. Brennan listened to their arguments with a patience born of exhaustion, understanding that their positions reflected everything they had been taught about military honor and the warrior code. But he also understood that honor was a luxury purchased with other people's lives, and he was being asked to buy glory with the currency of 200 men who trusted him to make the decision that gave them the best chance of seeing their families again. The weight of command settled over Brennan like physical mass, crushing and inescapable, as he made the calculations that would determine whether he was remembered as a coward or a pragmatist, or something more complex than either label could capture. His mind moved through the probabilities with the same methodical precision he had once applied to mathematical proofs, assigning rough percentages to different outcomes. If they stayed and fought and the German intelligence was false, they might survive another 2 or 3 days before ammunition ran out and they were overrun anyway. If the intelligence was accurate, they would all be dead within hours, obliterated by artillery fire against which foxholes and courage offered no protection. A breakout might save 20% of his men, possibly as many as 50 if luck ran with them, but would guarantee the death of the rest. Surrender offered the highest probability that most of his company would survive to see the end of the war, but it required him to make a choice that would be interpreted as cowardice by everyone who had not been in this frozen forest facing this impossible decision. Brennan called his officers together one final time and informed them of his decision in a voice that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath his calm surface. They would surrender at dawn, raising white flags and approaching German lines with weapons raised above their heads. Fisher's response was immediate and vitriolic, accusations of cowardice and dereliction of duty spilling from his mouth before Brennan cut him off with a sharp command. The captain explained his reasoning with the same patient clarity he had once used to explain differential equations to confused students. The German intelligence suggested artillery bombardment was imminent. A breakout would cost too many lives with uncertain results, and surrender offered the highest probability that the majority of them would survive to return home when the war ended. Chen remained silent, his face unreadable, but his eyes showed disappointment that cut deeper than Fisher's anger. Brennan dismissed them to spread word to the men, watching them walk away with the knowledge that he had just destroyed his reputation and possibly his life, but had potentially saved 200 others. It was a trade he believed worth making even as it hollowed him out inside. The response from the enlisted men ranged from stunned disbelief to outright hostility. Soldiers who had followed Brennan's orders for months without question now looked at him with expressions mixing contempt and betrayal, as if he had revealed himself to be something shameful that had been masquerading as their commander. Several sergeants attempted to organize resistance to the surrender order, arguing that the men should refuse and mount the breakout Fisher had advocated. Brennan met with them individually, explaining his reasoning again and again, appealing to their pragmatism, if not their approval. He reminded them that they had families waiting at home, that survival was not shameful even if the method felt that way, that he was willing to bear the burden of this decision so they did not have to. Some accepted his explanation with grim resignation, others rejected it entirely, but none could deny that the captain was offering himself up as a sacrifice for their potential survival. By taking sole responsibility for the surrender, Brennan ensured that his men would be seen as following orders rather than choosing cowardice themselves. Dawn came cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow and obscured whatever sun might have offered illumination or comfort. Brennan fashioned a white flag from a torn bedsheet scavenged from a destroyed farmhouse, attaching it to a rifle barrel with wire that cut into his hands as he twisted it tight. His company assembled in the clearing that had served as their defensive position for 3 days, arranged in formation more ragged than any parade ground would have tolerated. Many of the men refused to look at Brennan, their faces turned away in shame or anger, while others stared directly at him with expressions that promised they would never forgive what he was asking them to do. Lieutenant Fisher stood apart from the main group, his body language radiating disgust, while Chen remained at his position among the men, neither supporting nor openly opposing the captain's decision. Brennan walked to the front of the formation, the white flag held high, and began the slow march toward the German lines with 200 soldiers following behind him, each step taking them further from military honor and deeper into the complicated territory where survival and shame intersect. The Germans received their surrender with a mixture of surprise and professional efficiency, their officers clearly having expected to find corpses rather than live prisoners when they finally swept the American position. The German lieutenant who accepted Brennan's surrender spoke excellent English and conducted himself with a formality that suggested he understood the weight of what was occurring. He informed Brennan that he and his men would be transported to a prisoner of war camp in the German interior, where they would be held according to the Geneva Conventions until the end of hostilities. Brennan asked only one question: when was the artillery barrage scheduled to begin? The German lieutenant consulted his watch and responded that it had been ordered for 0700 hours, approximately 90 minutes from the current moment. The American position would have been subjected to a rolling barrage lasting 3 hours, more than 500 heavy guns firing in coordinated patterns designed to ensure that nothing survived within the target zone. The German officer's expression suggested he appreciated the calculation that had led to Brennan's surrender, recognizing a pragmatic decision even if he would not have made it himself. The artillery barrage began exactly on schedule as Baker Company marched under guard toward collection points behind German lines. The sound reached them even at distance, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the earth and the sky simultaneously. The concentrated fury of hundreds of guns firing in sequence. Brennan did not look back toward the forest where they had been positioned, but many of his men did, watching the distant tree line disappear behind curtains of smoke and flame that confirmed what their captain had told them. The bombardment continued for the full 3 hours the German lieutenant had indicated, an unrelenting assault that would have killed every one of them if they had still been in those positions. The realization settled over the company gradually, understanding dawning in faces that had shown only contempt hours earlier. Brennan had been right about the intelligence, right about the bombardment, and his decision to surrender had saved them from annihilation. But that recognition did not translate into gratitude or forgiveness. Instead, it generated a complicated mixture of relief and resentment that would characterize their relationship for the remainder of their captivity. The prisoner of war camp to which Baker Company was eventually transported was located in eastern Germany, a sprawling complex of barracks and wire that held thousands of Allied prisoners in conditions that violated the Geneva Conventions more often than they honored them. Food was scarce, medical care nearly non-existent, and the guards ranged from professionally correct to sadistically cruel, depending on individual temperament and the progress of the war. Brennan and his men were processed through the camp administrative system and assigned to barracks based on rank and capture circumstances, the officers separated from enlisted men according to protocol. The story of Brennan's surrender spread quickly through the prison population, whispered from barrack to barrack, with the kind of salacious detail that accompanies scandal. He became known throughout the camp as the captain who had surrendered with ammunition still remaining, who had chosen captivity over combat, who had violated the fundamental code that soldiers fought until victory or death decided the outcome. Other American officers shunned him, refusing to acknowledge his presence during the exercise periods when prisoners were allowed into the yard, treating him as if he carried a contagious disgrace that might infect anyone who associated with him too closely. The psychological toll of universal condemnation weighed on Brennan more heavily than the physical deprivations of camp life. He could endure hunger and cold and the constant threat of violence from guards who enjoyed exercising power over helpless prisoners. But the isolation from his fellow officers, the contempt from his own men, and the knowledge that his name was being mentioned in the same breath as Benedict Arnold and other American traitors, these gnawed at him in ways that physical suffering could not match. He maintained his dignity through routine and discipline, rising each morning to perform calisthenics in his tiny space, spending hours working through mathematical problems in his head to keep his mind sharp, writing letters to his wife that he knew had almost no chance of reaching her, but that provided the illusion of connection to the life he had left behind. At night, he lay on his wooden bunk and replayed the decision over and over, examining it from every angle, searching for the flaw in his reasoning that would justify the universal judgment against him. He found none. Every calculation still pointed to the same conclusion: surrender had offered the highest probability of survival for the maximum number of men, and he would make the same choice again if faced with identical circumstances. 6 months into their captivity, as winter gave way to spring and the sounds of Allied artillery grew louder in the west, suggesting that liberation might be approaching, Lieutenant Chen sought out Brennan during an exercise period. The younger officer approached with visible reluctance, and when he spoke, his voice carried emotions that had been fermenting throughout their imprisonment. Chen admitted that he had spent months hating Brennan for the shame of surrender, for the humiliation of living when honor demanded they fight and die. But time and distance had given him perspective that was impossible to achieve in the heat of battle and the immediate aftermath of capture. He had thought extensively about the alternative scenarios: the breakout attempt that would have killed most of them, the defensive stand that would have ended in artillery obliteration. From where Chen stood now, alive and reasonably healthy, and with realistic hope of eventually returning to his family, Brennan's decision appeared different than it had in the frozen Ardennes. Chen could not say he would have made the same choice, could not claim to forgive Brennan entirely, but he could acknowledge that the captain had been right about the probabilities and the outcomes. The liberation of the camp came in April 1945, when Soviet forces advancing from the east overran the guards and threw open the gates to reveal prisoners who were skeletal shadows of the men who had entered. Baker Company had survived captivity at a higher rate than most units, losing only 18 men to disease and malnutrition during their months of imprisonment. The 182 survivors were eventually repatriated through displaced persons camps and medical facilities, their physical health slowly restored, though their psychological scars remained raw and unhealed. Brennan was immediately placed under arrest upon return to American lines, charged with desertion in the face of the enemy and dereliction of duty. His court-martial was convened with unusual speed, driven by command's desire to make an example that would discourage any other officers from considering surrender as a viable tactical option. The prosecution presented a devastating case, built on testimony from Fisher and other officers who portrayed Brennan as a coward who had cracked under pressure and betrayed his duty. The fact that his men had survived because of his decision was dismissed as irrelevant to the question of whether he had violated military law and honor. The defense of Thomas Brennan was undertaken by a military attorney named Sarah Morrison, a captain in the Judge Advocate General's Corps who had handled dozens of court-martial cases during the war. Morrison recognized immediately that she could not win on the honor question. Brennan had violated military doctrine and warrior tradition in ways that no amount of argument could explain away within the value system that governed martial culture. Instead, she built her defense around outcome and intent, arguing that Brennan's decision had been made with full knowledge of its consequences to himself and in service of the higher duty to preserve the lives of the men under his command. She presented testimony from the German prisoner whose intelligence had informed Brennan's decision, brought forward meteorological records and German military documents proving the artillery barrage had occurred exactly as predicted, and demonstrated through meticulous calculation that any alternative course of action would have resulted in catastrophic casualties. Morrison's closing argument challenged the court to define courage in terms more complex than simple willingness to die. suggesting that sometimes the harder choice required living with shame rather than dying with honor intact. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation, a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but reflected the court's struggle with questions that had no clear answers within existing military law. Brennan was found guilty of dereliction of duty but acquitted of desertion, acknowledging that his actions violated protocol while stopping short of characterizing them as cowardice or treason. He was stripped of rank, dismissed from service, and forbidden from receiving any military honors or benefits for his wartime service. The sentence was delivered with unusual commentary from the presiding judge, who noted for the record that the court recognized Brennan's actions had saved lives but could not set a precedent that would encourage other officers to surrender when fighting remained possible. Brennan received the verdict with the same stoic calm he had shown throughout the proceedings, his face revealing nothing of whatever emotions churned beneath the surface. He was 33 years old, his military career destroyed, his reputation ruined, his name associated with shame rather than service. But 182 men were alive, who would have been dead if he had chosen differently, and that arithmetic provided cold comfort during the dark nights that followed. The years after the war were difficult for Thomas Brennan, in ways that went beyond the obvious challenges of rebuilding a life after public disgrace. He returned to his wife and daughters in upstate New York, resuming his position as a high school mathematics teacher, attempting to reconstruct the quiet existence he had known before the war, transformed him into something he had never wanted to become. But the scandal followed him like a shadow, newspaper articles and local gossip ensuring that everyone knew about the captain who had surrendered his company. Some parents demanded he be removed from teaching, arguing that a coward had no business shaping the minds of young people. The school board supported him, recognizing that whatever had happened in Belgium had no bearing on his competence as an educator. But the controversy created an atmosphere of suspicion and judgment that permeated his daily life. Brennan endured it with the same patience he had shown in the POW camp, focusing on his equations and his students and his family, finding meaning in small accomplishments when larger vindication seemed impossible. The shift in how Brennan's decision was perceived came gradually, accumulating through individual revelations rather than any single dramatic moment of collective realization. As the men of Baker Company returned to their lives across America, they began to process their experience with the perspective that time and distance provided. Many started families, built careers, lived the lives that Brennan's decision had made possible, and with each year that passed, the shame of surrender faded, while gratitude for survival grew stronger. They began reaching out to their former captain, letters arriving at his address in upstate New York that expressed sentiments ranging from grudging acknowledgement to heartfelt thanks. Some apologized for their anger and contempt during captivity, recognizing that they had been so focused on abstract honor that they failed to appreciate the concrete gift of continued existence. Others simply reported on their lives, marriages and children, jobs and homes, the accumulation of ordinary experiences that would have been impossible if artillery had annihilated them in that frozen forest. Each letter was both vindication and reopening of wounds, proof that Brennan had been right, but also reminder of the price he had paid for being right. The formal recognition came 23 years after the surrender, when a group of Baker Company veterans organized a reunion and specifically invited Thomas Brennan to attend. He had refused previous reunion invitations, uncertain of his welcome and unwilling to create awkwardness by his presence. But this invitation came with additional information that suggested something different was being planned. Nearly 100 of the surviving men from Baker Company gathered in a hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., most of them now middle-aged, with graying hair and expanding waistlines, bearing the physical marks of lives fully lived. When Brennan entered the room, unsure of what reception awaited him, he was met with standing ovation that continued for nearly 5 minutes. Grown men with tears streaming down their faces, applauding the decision that had saved their lives and allowed them to become who they were. Lieutenant Chen, now a successful architect, stepped forward and presented Brennan with a plaque that had been commissioned by the company's survivors, its inscription reading simply, to Captain Thomas Brennan, who had the courage to choose life over glory. From the 200 men who came home because of him. The public rehabilitation of Brennan's reputation proceeded slowly but inexorably as the veterans of Baker Company became increasingly vocal about what their captain had done and why. They wrote letters to newspapers and magazines, contacted military historians working on comprehensive accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, and testified before military review boards considering whether Brennan's court-martial verdict should be overturned or modified. Their argument was straightforward and increasingly difficult to dismiss. Thomas Brennan had made the tactically and morally correct decision under impossible circumstances, and he had been punished for it by a military culture that valued abstract honor over human life. The fact that his decision violated doctrine and tradition did not make it wrong, they insisted. It made those doctrines and traditions inadequate to address the complex realities of modern warfare, where survival and victory were not always synonymous. Military establishment resistance to this reinterpretation remained strong, driven by concern that validating Brennan's choice would undermine the warrior ethos that motivated soldiers to fight when logic suggested surrender made more sense. The final chapter of Thomas Brennan's story unfolded in 1976 when the Secretary of Defense announced that Brennan's court-martial verdict was being set aside and his discharge upgraded to honorable in recognition of extraordinary circumstances and subsequent evidence supporting his tactical judgment. The announcement carefully avoided characterizing the original verdict as wrong, instead suggesting that evolving understanding of command decisions under combat stress warranted reconsideration of individual cases. Brennan was 64 years old by then, long retired from teaching and living quietly with his wife in the same small town where he had started. The news reached him via telephone call from a Pentagon official, and Brennan's response was characteristically understated. He thanked the official for the notification and said he appreciated the gesture, though his tone suggested the vindication came too late to heal wounds that had calcified over 3 decades. But that evening, sitting on his porch as summer darkness fell over upstate New York, Thomas Brennan allowed himself to acknowledge that the weight he had carried since December 1944 had lightened fractionally, that perhaps history had finally caught up with the decision he had made when history was still being written. Thomas Brennan died in 1983 at the age of 71. His passing noted in obituaries that identified him as the controversial World War II officer whose surrender had saved 200 men. His funeral was attended by more than 300 people, including 87 veterans of Baker Company, who traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the man they had once reviled and eventually recognized as the truest kind of hero. They told stories about their captain who had chosen shame over glory, who had made the hard decision rather than the easy one, who had understood that sometimes courage manifests not in fighting, but in the willingness to bear contempt so others might live. The mathematics teacher, who had never wanted to be a soldier, was buried with full military honors, the ceremony conducted with precision that would have satisfied the most exacting standards. As taps echoed across the cemetery and the flag was folded with ceremonial care, the survivors of Baker Company stood at attention, tears flowing freely down weathered faces, each man privately acknowledging that he owed every year since 1944 to a captain who had been called a coward for refusing to let them die for nothing. The legacy of Thomas Brennan extends beyond the specific circumstances of his decision and into the broader question of how courage should be defined and recognized within military culture. His story became a case study at military academies, used to provoke discussion about the relationship between tactical doctrine and moral responsibility, about when following rules serves the mission and when it becomes an excuse for avoiding difficult choices. Some instructors held up Brennan as an example of principled leadership that prioritized mission success over personal reputation, while others warned that his decision represented a dangerous precedent that could justify any surrender if framed in terms of preserving lives. The debate continued across generations of officers, never fully resolved because the questions Brennan's choice raised admitted no simple answers. What emerged from these discussions was a more nuanced understanding that courage takes many forms, that the warrior code evolved for specific historical circumstances does not always translate effectively to modern combat, and that sometimes the hardest battle is fought not against an external enemy, but against internal pressure to conform to expectations, even when conformity means death. In the small town in upstate New York, where Thomas Brennan taught mathematics for 35 years, a scholarship was established in his name, awarded annually to a student who demonstrates moral courage in standing up for what is right, even when facing opposition or ridicule. The scholarship's criteria specifically mention Brennan's wartime decision, framing it as an example of the kind of principled independence the award seeks to encourage. Each year, the recipient is told the story of the teacher who became a captain, who made an impossible choice in a frozen forest, who endured decades of contempt before finally receiving recognition that came too late to undo the damage, but early enough to matter. The students who receive the scholarship carry forward Brennan's legacy into contexts he never imagined, applying the lessons of his experience to contemporary challenges that require standing against consensus when consensus is wrong. In this way, the decision made on a December morning in 1944 continues to ripple forward, influencing choices made by people who never wore uniforms or heard artillery fire, but who face their own moments when courage demands choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. The 182 men of Baker Company who survived because Thomas Brennan chose shame over glory lived a collective 15,000 additional years beyond what would have been their deaths in the Ardennes. They raised more than 400 children, contributed to their communities in countless ways, experienced joy and heartbreak, and the full texture of human existence that the artillery barrage would have obliterated. When considering Brennan's legacy, these numbers matter more than medals or rank, or the opinions of people who were not in that frozen forest facing that impossible choice. The mathematics of his decision were always clear to Brennan, even when clouded by judgment and condemnation. 200 lives saved versus 1 reputation destroyed represented an equation with an obvious solution for anyone willing to bear the cost of being right. That some people never accepted this arithmetic, that others took decades to understand it, did not change the fundamental truth that Thomas Brennan saw clearly in December 1944 and acted upon despite knowing exactly what it would cost him. He was called a coward for making the brave choice, punished for being right, and vindicated only after time proved what he had known all along. That sometimes the most courageous act is refusing to sacrifice others on the altar of personal honor. That true leadership requires bearing burdens, so those you command do not have to, and that the warrior who chooses life over death, when death would be easier, deserves recognition for a form of courage that transcends simple willingness to fight and embraces the harder responsibility of ensuring that fighting serves a purpose beyond its own perpetuation.